So good afternoon and welcome to our Future of Consultancy webinar. This afternoon we're going to be talking about business models and contracts. I've got some great guest panelists here with me, and we have got the opportunity for you to ask questions. So we will present some of the emerging thoughts, some things for discussion at the start of the session, and then we will have around 20 minutes at the end for you to put your questions in. So please, if you wanted to ask a question at any point, put it forward in your webinar software. You'll be able to type it in on the right hand side of your screen, and we will come to those as we move through the webinar itself. Okay. So if I can just start by introducing my panel. I've got some really great panelists with some really fantastic brains for you to test this afternoon. So there's myself. I'm not including myself in that, obviously. So I'm Hannah because I'm the Chief Executive of ACE and previously of the Treasury, and I did a lot of commercial strategy for clients. So that's my approach that I'll be looking at when we come to this is how the clients would look at it. I've also got Mark Enzer. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
Mark is the Chief Technical Officer at Mott MacDonald, so he is going to be giving us his insights from inside a large consultancy, and particularly through the lens of digital transformation and what that might mean in terms of our new business models and contracts. And then finally, Andrew. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you.
Andrew Croft is a Senior Associate at Beale & Company, and he is going to be dealing with all difficult questions in relation to construction law and contract terms for us to try and help us navigate through what will be a transition, I think, to different business models in future, which would have potentially quite different ways of us contracting with our clients. So please save all your very difficult questions for Andrew. He's looking forward to it. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a bit of scene setting and a bit of an introduction to the Future of Consultancy campaign for each of you, recognising that it's relatively new and you may not have got to speed with it yet. And then we're going to move through and present a few ideas and some case studies around the types of business models that we might be using in future. We'll have a little bit of a discussion with each of the panel members around those. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit around what we think the clients might need to do to enable us to deploy these new business models in future. So to start with, it's worth taking stock of the environment around us. So most of you will have heard of the government's industrial strategy and the construction sector deal that's come out of that. Now, this is quite significant for our industry because it demonstrates real commitment, both financially and in terms of government acting as a major construction client and their willingness to change in terms of how they have that government industry relationship. You can see in the centre the priorities of the government's industrial strategy, particularly for the construction sector deal. They're looking at digital transformation, how that they can increase that in the industry, in the sector, how they can increase the amount of off-site manufacturing we do, and also a better focus on whole life performance of the infrastructure system and assets and the built environment as a whole. Alongside that, they've committed about £170 million worth of government funding. Now, whilst not a lot, it's more than we've ever had before as a construction sector, and so we should be thinking about how we can demonstrate that we are responding to it in such a way that we can hopefully get ourselves some industry match funding and continue to benefit from that sort of government financial support. Because this financial support isn't about buying projects, it's about investing in us as an industry and investing in our businesses to help us evolve and improve our productivity and deliver on those three ambitions that they've set out. So it's a real opportunity for us. So off the back of that, ACE started the Future of Consultancy campaign, and you can see the impacts there that we are aiming to achieve with the campaign. And obviously it's going to take us a few years, particularly some of those are quite lofty, but you can see there's how we would contribute to the construction strategy 2025 and the impacts there. But equally, the bottom four are very much more around us as an industry. And actually, through the campaign, what we're aiming to do is to try to get us to a stage where, as an industry, we've reduced our skills shortage. We've got really, good, productive, sustainable consultancy businesses that are, taking advantage of the new opportunities available to us through digital transformation. And in doing so, we have increased client satisfaction, better industry reputation, and also our ability to export is enhanced. So there's a lot to play for here if we get this right. So it's great that you're taking the time to engage with us today on the webinar. Okay. So just a little bit of detail around what the actual campaign is aiming to achieve. So this year is very much about us as an industry taking stock of where we're going in future. Obviously today we're focusing on what our future business models and contracts would be. And like I said, there's a number of these events happening between now and June where we deep dive into different topics. And then we will get together at the conference in the middle of June to really look at it as a whole and actually try to unpick what might be our sort of industry strategy going forward. And then finally in October, we hopefully will be in a position where we all agree at a high level what it is that we're trying to achieve. And we'll launch that alongside a roadmap and implementation plan, so what we actually need to do together to deliver on it. So just to close off the introduction, the first phase, October, is aimed at setting out some deliverables and setting a bit of a strategic direction for us as an industry as a whole. So we're going to do a bit of work around understanding what the domestic and export opportunities are, what our markets will be doing, and actually where we might be able to offer different services as a result of digital transformation. So we're going to be publishing that as a guide for businesses and for our clients in October. Now, alongside that, there's a couple of enablers to making that happen. So our blueprint for the future business models, obviously that's what we're going to be discussing in more detail today. And then finally, a business development handbook, which is aiming to try to offer a sort of how-to guide for businesses as they move through this transformation, as they grow and evolve over the next few years. It will really pick up the detail of what is available to you and how you can find your way amongst the plethora of initiatives and support that's available to you at the moment. So that's what we're aiming to deliver in October. And hopefully you're going to be a part of it. So we're very much looking forward to your feedback and questions today to help us shape this. Okay. So like I said, under our opportunities piece, there's probably two elements. There's what the domestic markets are going to be doing and what the export markets are going to be doing. And it's really important that actually everything that we do with this strategy is tangible and linked to what clients are going to be spending on in future. So that's one filter we'll be applying to it. Okay, and then like I said, the two enablers that we'll be looking at are the business models and the skills. And today we're going to be looking specifically at the business models. So the two questions that we're going to be exploring, and I will say exploring because this is very much a sort of two-way conversation, is around what the business models of the future, and we've got some examples and some case studies to put in front of you, and then what the new contract terms should be as well. So that's where I said we're really going to start to test Andrew's brain around actually how would we do something that is quite radically different to what we might be used to at present. Okay. So into the real meat of it. What we're going to look at effectively through digital transformation is our businesses moving from a model that is expertise sold by the hour to needing to be able to bring some business models to the table that allow us to combine the three things on the right here, for enabling us to be able to combine our data, our expertise, and our products and technology solutions into a service for the clients. And you can see straight away there's a big potential disjoint between how we sell things currently and actually what we'll need to be able to do in future. So it's really important for sort of the long-term growth and sustainability of the industry that we find a way of being able to get a return on investment for the data and the products and the technology solutions to allow us to continue to grow and actually to allow our productivity to improve. If we were to stick with our current expertise by the hour model, we'd actually only be able to recoup part of that investment, and we'd be in a downward spiral in terms of being able to improve our productivity, but actually being able to be sustainable businesses that invest in our people. So that's the big shift. And like I said, what we're going to look at today are a number of different ways in which we might be able to combine those three things in, as Mark terms it, the donut on the right, to be able to sell those. So what are the models for us to be able to structure ourselves and sell that combination of those three things on the right? Okay. The other thing I think we need to be mindful of in this is actually understanding where we'll be selling this. So at the moment, traditionally, if you're an engineering consultancy, you'd be very much working at a project level. You might be working, on detailed design, on engineering design, and that's where the majority of our revenue has come from. Whereas now, actually, we've got, this plethora of data that is going to be available to us. We've got these interesting digital tools, and actually we've got the ability to be able to do things at a much greater scale. So to be able to, deploy our expertise actually at a much higher level for the client. So we could be working in terms of advising them on their networks and their systems, actually taking an in-depth look at their assets and the conditions of their assets. All of those sorts of things are much easier for a consultancy firm to move into, much better for us to be able to offer value to clients in those markets. So I think actually we'll start to see this move out of just being revenue generated from projects to being revenue generated advising clients all around their sort of asset system. And you can see here we've got this sort of virtuous circle of, as an industry, being able to hand off to each other, or to be able to work with our partner organisations and our supply chain to actually be able to understand, because we add so much value being able to do this, working across clients and being able to sell those three things that I referred to on the previous slide. So I think there's a real shift here in terms of how we view ourselves and what our value proposition is for the clients. It's very much more about being able to move around with them at all levels and across clients to be able to offer these services. Okay. So if I could just pause there and have a look at what that might mean for our business models. This is where we really start to get into the detail. So you can see the donuts made a reappearance on the top left-hand corner. You'll be sick of the donut by the end of this webinar, I can assure you. But essentially what we're starting to explore through the research that AC has been doing and drawing on a lot of the initiatives that are out there already around things like Project 13 is actually how do we take that combination of donuts constituent parts and sell that? What are the business models that will fairly reward us and also give the clients the right comfort and right confidence that they are incentivising their supply chain in the right way. So as it stands at the moment, we've scoped out about 5 different ways in which that we think we can structure this and sell these pieces. And what we're now going to do is just sort of start to discuss with the panel each of these 5, give some examples, and maybe throw up some of the areas where we think it might be quite challenging, either from a consultancy firm perspective or from a client perspective to move to these, because those are the sorts of things that we need to flesh out really. Just before we move into the detail of each of the case studies, you can see actually, what's quite interesting here is if you look at the bottom, the expertise, we think probably there's only one situation in future where you would be deploying that sort of expertise time-based model. We'll cover that now, but it's just, you can see here the magnitude of the shift actually in terms of how we generate our revenue and how our businesses are set up to do that. So this is a sort of fundamental shift really, and I think potentially this is the thing that could unlock a lot of the challenges that we have around being able to have proper sort of investment in R&D, proper investment in our people, such that they are a really valuable resource to us. So there's quite a big shift here. Like I said, I think now if we just sort of go through each of these in turn and have a look at what we think, and I said ultimately what we want to try to do out of this webinar is to gauge people's experiences, to gauge feedback on these and see whether we are developing this in the right direction, whether there is a model that we could be deploying that someone's seen in a different markets that perhaps we might want to consider. So those are all the things to start to think about really as we move through these. What would it mean for your business to start to move to selling on one of these types of models? Perhaps in some cases you do it already, but if that was the majority of how your revenue came in, what impact might that have in terms of how you price jobs, in terms of how you structure your business and what what your constituent parts are made up of? Okay, so on that basis, I think we'll start the debate, and you can see the donut is here again, because on the first model we're looking at how we combine these 3, so this data, this expertise, and these products and technology solutions. And in this case, we're looking at a case study around design for manufacture, or something where you would have this sort of move towards more standardized design. So if I just start by describing the situation and then giving an overview of the business model, and I think then I'll open it up to my panel to sort of put in some comments about where they've seen this before. Andrew, if you can cover off what this might mean around contract terms and how, again, we can sort of take stock of what that means in terms of the difference in contracts to what we see today. So a design for manufacture, I mean, this would be something where you a client had aspirations one way or another, whether it was through manufacturing or whether it was just through wanting to standardize their asset base. If they wanted to invest upfront quite a lot in an initial design that could then be reconfigured to make it, a bit more site specific, I think typically you'd have somebody on a long-term contract here. looking at, being able to learn from experience in terms of how the design performs, and actually have that kind of reconfiguration fee at a lower level. So a little bit different perhaps to what we've been used to. But again, in that initial design fee, you'd be costing in there the data and any sort of products and technology solutions you might need to develop to enable that future reconfiguration. So that's probably the structure of the kind of situation and the business model. So Mark, perhaps I could bring you in there in terms of what you make of that, and how do you think that sort of conceptually matches with what you see currently in the marketplace?
Yes, so I don't see this happening in the marketplace just now, but I see it emerging. And I think that it's a natural thing for it to emerge, because particularly when it comes to design for manufacture, which is very closely connected to the idea of product-based delivery, where a particular product can be designed ready for manufacture, and then sit in a catalogue, and so that means that the design process becomes more one of kind of dragging and dropping ready designed products into a solution, rather than designing them from scratch each time. That kind of thinking is definitely already around. What we haven't seen yet is for that to mature into a platform that reflects this, but we can definitely see it coming. And so looking at that same thing from a slightly different angle, if the starting point is for consultancies to realise that it's a good idea to have some kind of digital component catalogue, a library of BIM objects that they've designed once, they can use many times, then that internal library obviously makes sense. Where I think we see it going is that internal library might want to be owned by asset owners. So rather than the asset owners getting a service from many different consultancies, all carrying their own private digital component catalogue, it makes sense for the asset owner to own that catalogue. And then it's not much of a jump from there to see it being an end-to-end delivery platform. So what you've got here, I think, reflects that, where there might be an initial design fee for the platform, and then some kind of ongoing, you call it a reconfiguration fee, but something to keep that platform working. So it's a kind of rather long way around saying that we don't see it yet, but we do see it coming.
That's really interesting, and that idea about actually an internal library, or is it an asset owner library? I think that those are the sorts of interesting discussions I think we should be having as an industry, and what are the benefits on either side, for doing that. I mean, something that I'm interested in as far as this is concerned is that this doesn't become a mechanism to dumb down design. So actually, could we encourage clients in their commercial strategy to be able to deploy this and to actually segment up the market in such a way that you may be doing a design on license for a certain type of school. So it might be a technology college or a school for disabled children, and actually then what you're able to do with each reconfiguration is see how it is performing, and to be able to bring the new innovations and really invest in that initial design for something that is very bespoke to that particular customer segment, which I think is, there's a risk there that we might dumb down design if we just, they do this, but they do it with just productivity in mind, rather than sort of high quality design and performance improvement, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on quite a few really interesting aspects there. One I think is to do with the design of the individual components and getting paid for that sits within the platform. And the other is the design of the platform itself, and how that gets paid for. And this whole issue about dumbing down design, I think, could easily become emotive. But in reality, there are a lot of things which shouldn't be designed again and again. We've designed them once, we can use them many times, and that's the route to efficiency. So I don't see that as dumbing down design. The design would be just as good. It's just that we're being efficient by using it again. And I totally buy the point that it might need to be reconfigured for a particular site location. But I think that that is essentially the route to reducing the design costs. However, and this is the kind of the plus side of that deal, If we are able to come up with those kind of standard designs and standard products that can be designed once and used many times, then that means that we don't need to use all the design effort on redesigning things, but it frees up design effort to design for other stuff.
Yes.
So it's not just about designing for manufacture, and designing for assembly, which is a kind of familiar terminology, but we can start designing for operation and for reuse, and designing for remanufacture and repurposing. Lots of things which we currently don't get the time to pay attention to, because we're constantly redesigning from scratch just the basic thing. If the basic thing has been designed, then we can put that effort into designing for all sorts of other benefits, which then release more value, that then we hopefully can be paid for, on the basis that we get paid for the value we add, rather than the time we spend doing it. So I don't see this as being dumbing down design at all.
No.
I see it about being efficient on the basic design, and I see it as opening up opportunities to design in lots more value.
Optimistic. You see, I was just skeptical of the clients. That's what it is. But no, but I think we're definitely on the same page there in terms of the benefits of it. And it's perhaps sort of gentle steering as far as the clients are concerned, to make sure that they do approach it in that way, rather than, like I said, just sort of current designing each time on a bespoke basis, and actually just seeing that as an opportunity to kind of cut down on costs.
But this really is a crunch point, isn't it? Because one points towards a kind of lowest price, the other points towards highest value.
Yes.
And I guess if the market does just want cheapest price, then that does point us in a pretty negative direction.
Yes.
Where it would just be kind of full automation, you get the same thing every time. Whereas if we can see that what we're actually aiming for is best value, meaning best outcomes for the ultimate customer, then all of those other things which I said can be added into the design, have genuine value, and will be valued and will be paid for because they have genuine value. So I think there's a kind of a philosophical point in here that the industry really needs to address, because down one route it goes to blackness and darkness and kind of dismal future. The other way points towards much better value for the customers, who are us, it's the citizens. And obviously I would want to go for the latter.
No, I think I completely agree. I guess part of it is then thinking about the scope of the initial design. Actually, how is it that we're making sure that is scoped around value rather than scoped around lowest cost and just efficiency of design time?
Absolutely, that's the point, isn't it? It's scoping it around value. That's exactly the point. Maybe we need a lawyer to.
I was going to say, how do we do that, Andrew? Yes, how do the other bugbears that we see in our contracts at the moment, will they be resolved? Do you think?
I think that the closest thing that I have seen personally to this sort of model that I think is happening out there at the moment is almost modular construction, and whereby you have the initial design is almost designing a system whereby all of these different components can fit together. In particular, that I know IKEA's construction arm are building a lot of hotels using this form of construction. And I think, I guess one of the legal issues that arises with that I've seen would be where, if a consultant isn't involved in that initial step of working out how the system's going to put together, but then is approached to design in relation to one particular project, and to some extent in doing that, they're going to be assuming some of the responsibility for the original design of the system, or they're going to want to make sure that the client provides some kind of assurance that the system does fit together, or has been designed appropriately. So I guess that's one of the risks where you have this sort of model, but for some reason the consultant involved at the start isn't involved in the projects going forward. And I think one of the general risks, which is on the slide at the moment, in terms of that initial design approach as well, would be where you're designing a product rather than a building, for example, or where you're designing a system that you know is going to be rolled out, there is more of a risk of fitness for purpose being implied into your as a matter of law, or becoming a requirement of your clients, because they want to make sure the design you're providing will work going forward. And I guess that's just one area where professional indemnity insurance arrangements and this approach at the moment wouldn't necessarily sit together particularly well, because for its purposes typically excluded from professional indemnity insurance. So I think that will need to be something that I guess is addressed in the initial discussions with clients, and I think discussed with insurers in terms of how that sort of, how fitness purpose on these sorts of projects would roll out. I think in terms of intellectual property, I guess that the biggest shift I think is that traditionally, historically, intellectual property licenses have been granted on the basis that they can be used for this project only, and the client can't use the design to construct an extension or construct another project elsewhere. And so there's that, I guess, industry shift in terms of this is the value that you're signing away almost, or that should be reflected in your fee. And just considering how wide any intellectual property license is going to be, so that it captures what the client actually wants to get out of it without exposing the consultant to unreasonable liability. And I guess the other point in terms of the relationship between the initial work and the reconfiguration fee, I think that any caveats to that reconfiguration fee and the base on which that's going to be structured would just need to be carefully thought out before you set out this arrangement, because as we all know, construction projects, everyone's different, and it's not, there are things on construction projects that you'll never have seen before that you won't have anticipated on a particular fee. So that will just be another area that will need to be thought about carefully. And I guess my initial feeling is that this would probably work best under almost a framework style arrangement, whereby a client can, obviously call off the further projects as and when required. And then there'll be a discussion before each project as to how the fee is going to work.
Yeah, so you'd have some sort of guaranteed continuity on that kind of reconfiguration fee, so it's the same consultant each time. I do wonder, whether I was being a bit overly optimistic, but if you say you were in that sort of a situation where you're on a long-term framework and you had the opportunity to sort of, use the same design, but keep testing it and seeing it in operation, is there an opportunity for that to lead to, do you think, lower risk in terms of professional indemnity if you've got that kind of long-term relationship and a single design that you're just sort of continuously working on?
Yes, I would hope that if it is, I don't want to use the word simpler, but if it's a case of making the design more straightforward, and it should reduce risk, because you're, as you say, you're just rolling out a design that's been tested again and again on new projects. And I would hope that is something that gives insurers some comfort to reduce insurance premiums if you can show that this is how you're operating. I think it's something that would need to be discussed with insurers at renewal, and I think it would be useful to get them involved, obviously, in this in this initiative, just to underline the benefits that can be gained.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. I said some of the sort of nuances in there around that and around how you might structure it in such a way, like I said, you don't then end up having to pass on, the IP to a different consultant to reconfigure it. I think it's quite interesting. There's a bit in there you certainly need to unpick, I guess. Okay. Thank you both. So on to the next one. So this is one that I think is much hyped, much interesting at the moment around Project 13, and obviously fantastic that we've got the earlier adopter projects that are working towards this. So I think it's really worthwhile us having a look at what this means for the business model of consultancies in this space. So just to recap, we've got the donut back. So again, we are going to be selling our 3 things rather than just our expertise, because there's all sorts of benefits to all parts of an alliance with us in being able to provide this. The types of places where you might see this. So, we know from the early adopters, obviously they're from the infrastructure client group. Now they are, tier 1, looking at their tier 1 relationships predominantly, or at least the top few tiers of their relationship, to try and create this more integrated project structure. The other place you might see it, and again, some of the early adopters, for example, the Environment Agency, are looking at, rather than just doing it on one big infrastructure project, having a long-term framework where they can sort of work on, a sort of an alliance which will deliver multiple projects, so similar to what At1 have achieved for Anglian Water. So there's a couple of different scenarios where you might get this, but typically it would be that sort of direct client, top tier or top couple of tiers client-supplier relationship. And it's very much about actually how do they, there's a sort of joint, I say joint liability, but I'm not going to go into that. We'll let Andrew deal with that. But certainly, joint incentive, joint contract even. So the 2 examples we've got at the bottom would be, everybody on the same contract. Or secondly, you might have individual contracts with the asset owner, the client, but actually have some sort of overlaid program level incentive. So those are the sort of 2. It's sort of, looking at actually where it is that, the deliverability of something doesn't just rely on yourself as a business, and you're not going with a sort of traditional joint venture approach. Actually, you're going with something which is very much more embedded with the asset owner, the client themselves. So if you take the Project 13 methodology, the performance incentive for these types of arrangements, for these types of contracts, are very much around delivering on the outcomes and having performance rewards based on the outcomes of the overall project. So, again, that sort of logically follows through where you're all on the same contract. But again, it does sort of start to ask some really big questions around risk sharing, around what we do in terms of design authority, our design liability, when you're all sort of working in this very, very closely embedded together. So, like I said, as a consultant, you could be on any one of these 2 contracts in a Project 13 scenario. So you might be in there as an advisor, perhaps offering advice on environmental consultancy. You might be in there as a supplier to bring a particular aspect to the design, or even as part of the integrator itself, which is very much about leveraging the expertise from across the supply chain and sort of getting the whole project up and running. And making sure that the expertise is integrated from across the different parties involved. So there's a number of different places you might pop up, but what we're talking about today is actually what that means in terms of your business model. So what is it that you are selling as part of that alliance structure, and how do you sort of enter into that in a way that means that you are going to be rewarded for value, but without sort of taking everybody else's risk on board with you. So some big questions, I think, with this one. So Mark, you're a long-standing Project 13 advocate leading the digital transformation workstream. So what do you make of these sorts of approaches? And obviously you must, to be there personally supporting it, see real benefit and real opportunity in terms of the value that consultancies can add in this type of arrangement.
Yeah, I definitely do. And I guess having spent 7 years with Anglian Water, I've kind of seen it up front as to how you can get many different parties working together to genuinely aligned objectives. And I think that's a really key part of this Project 13 idea. It is having those aligned objectives, which are to do with the outcomes. It might be that the owner, the asset owner, also kind of owns, in inverted commas, the outcomes on behalf of the ultimate customers. But the whole idea of the enterprise, the collection of all the parties you see on this slide, is that they work together towards those outcomes and get rewarded together for those outcomes and manage risk together towards those outcomes. So I think the model is very good. How consultants get paid within that, I guess, is the point of this slide of what we're talking about. And I guess it's kind of a combination of having costs covered, but also getting rewarded as part of the enterprise. And I think that the key thing there is about the balance between those 2 things. And there is a danger that if the reward to cover costs is too high, in relation to being rewarded for the outcomes, then the outcomes are not sufficient incentive to really get people keen on driving towards them. The other way around, if the rewards for the kind of cost covering fee is not sufficient and everything is on the outcomes, then that can kind of put off, it can kind of delay the reward too long, and it just means that it's untenable as a business model. You can't wait that long for the outcomes to happen to then be rewarded. So I think that what makes this work or not work is actually the balance between those two things, and it's a clever person that works out what that balance is, that drives genuine incentivization, that is genuinely shared, but is also equitable on the journey.
No, I think that's a really key point here, and certainly something I think we need to explore and understand from a consultancy perspective. Just picking up on what you said, costs covered. I think there's we're just again thinking about what makes up those costs, and actually, in this scenario, it might be that it's costs to cover your expertise, but actually you need to be paying down on things like the investments you've made in your data, the investments that you've made in your products and technology solutions that you're going to bring to bear as part of this enterprise relationship. So I think there is a bit there around just thinking that we shouldn't be entering into these sorts of arrangements on an hours basis. It should be on a sort of value added output, and then, like you say, thinking about over and above that, how do we get into this kind of outcome based almost bonus that you might be able to achieve if the whole thing is paying off and working well as an overarching enterprise. But I think there's certainly something for us to avoid slipping into this being an hours based, sort of output based consultancy, traditional business model, just with some sort of performance incentive overlaid on it, because I don't think that would necessarily work in terms of return on investment for some of the other things that we want to be investing in.
Very much so. I think that a lot of those other things which we want to be investing in would be shared between the enterprise. So it wouldn't just be the individual consultant wanting to invest for their own benefit. It would be the enterprise wanting to invest for the enterprise's benefit, and the consultant would be part of it. So I think it's the shared approach in this which is the bit to crack. It's how do you make it a genuinely shared approach rather than just looking at it purely through the blinkers of one consultant within it. And I think that the integrator has a really key part to play in that. I think that the integrator role is really interesting, in fact exciting, because I think it can make a massive difference in the industry if we get that right. And I think that the integrator would be doing at least three things, probably more. And there'd be one about production management, managing the end-to-end process, including design and engineering and manufacturing and logistics and assembly, etc. The whole thing, end-to-end. But also I think information management, because I think information would be that golden thread which joins everything up. And I think also something to do with program management, which is very familiar to us. Now, I think that many consultancies would have a lot to offer in that space. But they should ideally be rewarded, as your point made, on the value they add rather than the time they spend doing it. And I think that there are potential models that could be looked at to do that. Something which is interesting, I think, in the context of an enterprise is looking at rewarding microtransactions, which could be done through a distributed ledger type technology, where it is possible to actually see the value that each adds, looking at information itself being of value. So those who add value to the information, who generate better insight to lead to better decisions, could potentially be rewarded for the individual bits of information that they're adding value to. So that would take us a long way away from the just getting paid on hours. And I think it is an interesting thing that we should be looking at in the context of all of these business models. But it certainly feels like it could work in this context.
When you've got that sort of transparency and openness because you're in an enterprise.
Exactly, and everyone in the enterprise would have access to that same kind of model, because if the enterprise is working on a common end-to-end delivery process, they would all be inputting into it. And that information that they're putting into it would be shared.
Okay, interesting. Wow, there's a lot there, isn't there, Andrew? I think there's certainly some expansion on that sort of how do you demonstrate that you might get paid on outcomes, and sort of unpicking some of that from a consultancy perspective.
Yes, and I mean an approach that we're seeing on a few alliances at the moment. It's something that I know, as well as the water companies, it's Network Rail have been adopting for a few years now. Is by, I mean, not just linking the pay and gain mechanism to the cost of the project, having an element that's linked, that's incentivise performance as well as the cost. So it's almost a way of adjusting the cost so that there is, and I guess that it's working out how you identify what those targets are, those incentives are at the outset, so that you're rewarded not just for whether you've come within budget or not, but also the ultimate benefit you're providing to the client. And so that's one element in terms of cost. I think alliancing in this form, alliances, firstly, is generally quite an overused word at the moment, and I think it can mean quite a lot of things, as you said, Hannah. Either it's a fairly loose, almost a framework arrangement, where the framework members work together, or there's also what is generally called pure alliancing, which is what I would say Network Rail are doing, and a lot of the water companies are doing at the moment. And that goes as far as you say, all the parties entering the same contract. There's that detailed pay and gain mechanism, and some of them even say, if there's any issue, we waive our right to bring claims against other members of the alliance, so that they're essentially saying that the only risks they're assuming under the alliance are not being able to make profit, subject to a few exceptions. I think there's some skepticism in the legal community, and some of those in the legal community, about how enforceable that sort of agreement is, because it's never been tested. But I think it's a really good way of getting the parties to focus on outcomes, as you say, and working together and not protecting themselves as a prime aim. It's interesting thinking about how professional indemnity insurance fits in with that sort of arrangement, because if that's the approach you're saying, professional indemnity insurance almost falls away to some extent, because if no claims can be made against each other, you shouldn't really need to rely on professional indemnity insurance. Obviously, there are the concerns I mentioned, and I think the approach that's often taken is that a contract will just be silent on professional indemnity insurance, and the team still obviously maintain it, but it's not a contractual requirement. And even some versions of this model, using integrated project insurance, adopt an insurance for the project, which takes place essentially of professional indemnity insurance, and will cover any claims as and when they arise, and also protect the client against certain cost overruns. So that's another version of alliancing that is being adopted on a few projects out there.
And that's had a few more trials potentially than where you said that actually that you kind of everybody's on the same contract and you all agree to never claim against each other. So how does that work? What's your, from a legal perspective, integrated project insurance? Is that, how is that working? Have you seen any claims come through in any of those projects, or any disagreements that you've had to mediate?
No, we haven't seen any claims on those sort of projects. I think it's still integrated project insurance in particular is still really getting going. There's been a couple of projects, as you say, and my understanding is that they have been successful, but it hasn't completely taken off. And I guess one almost barrier to the pure alliancing model across the industry as a whole at the moment is that it's generally best suited to larger scale projects or larger scale programs, I guess. It's not it involves a lot of upfront investment and a lot of upfront what I would call brainwashing, for want of a better word, to get the project team sort of all working together in the right way. It hasn't yet been rolled out on your sort of standard construction projects at the moment too much, I think, other than, for example, a few IPI projects. So I think there have, from my understanding, the main one issue that has arisen from alliancing projects is tying it in to the supply chain, and how that all fits together. And I think that is a challenge, because you have essentially the top tier alliance, where they are all very much in tune with the alliancing approach and working together, and subcontractors and subconsultants often don't quite have that history or experience, and it's trying to almost have mini alliances underneath the overall alliance that make sure that doesn't create an additional
I guess, or just even as a minimum getting the contracts to back against perhaps some of the sort of performance incentives that you'd have at this level. Okay, great. So that leads us well on to probably what will be our last case study, because we've had quite a lot of debate on this, which is good. So the last one we'll cover today, we might have to think about doing a second business models webinar, would be, I guess, what you might see surrounding one of those alliances, or even as the sort of, underneath that alliance contract as the kind of payment mechanism within it, is this mixture of outputs and outcomes that Mark was describing. So, you could have this same mechanism deployed just in a one-to-one contract where it's just yourselves and your clients. So again, there's two parts to it. So there is a specified output, hopefully specified in terms of value, and then certainly a sort of alongside that, an outcome-based incentive. So that might be sort of an outcome-based bonus. Again, very much there needing to be defined in terms of value rather than the outcome being lowest cost, because then we're just sort of dressing up perhaps some of our transactional relationships that we have at the moment. So the types of places where you could deploy this would be an outline design, whereas that would be your output, but actually the value that you deliver through that design for the overall project, so that the ability that you've been able to bring to bear in that design that impacts on the sort of increase in value of the overall scheme, that could be linked to your performance bonus. The same with the development of a business case. So the output would be, here's the business case, but the outcome might be actually if you've been able to work the business case in such a way that the cost benefit ratio has gone up, or you've been able to incorporate additional benefits. So I think, again, they're sort of looking at this with two sides. As Mark said, it's a really key definition to be able to sort of balance those off, certainly when it comes to defining the fee and the return that you would get from entering this sort of contractual relationship. So how much of it, how much of the weighting is on your output, how much, if the weighting is on the performance bonus, and that's probably a sort of, contract by contract discussion to be had. But I think there's some interesting stuff for us to unpick there as we carry on with this research. But it's just thinking about those two, and again, in that scenario, making sure that the fee there is a function of those three things that we're looking to sell, rather than just be a fee based on hours spent. So it may be a fixed fee on the for the production of the output, with some sort of value-based metrics around determining a bonus for the delivery of the outcome. So I think that's some really interesting stuff there. We touched on it a little bit already, but just anything else there that you wanted to add from a sort of digital transformation perspective, Mark, around what you see in MOTS and whether you have any of these sorts of relationships perhaps?
Yes, I definitely see that the digital overlay is relevant to this, for sure. And I guess where I see that coming in is in the concept of an information value chain. So very briefly, what I mean by that is taking data, making sense of it to get insights. That might be through an analysis or something of that nature, and then feeding those insights into making better decisions, which lead to better interventions, which lead to better outcomes. So what that points to is a direct connection between data and outcomes. And to get from data to the better outcomes means some real value added work around generating those insights, also making the better decisions. And so I see that kind of digital transformation overlay really informs this and gives us a route towards getting those better outcomes per whole life pound.
Yes.
It's not just trying to squeeze the old thing dry. It's actually doing a new thing to get better outcomes for less whole life cost, which I think really should be the definition of value as we go forwards. So definitely digital has an overlay onto this. I mean, I have to say, I see this as potentially being very closely connected to what we were talking about just now with the alliance. So I see this kind of model being the type of model that could underpin that alliance type of framework. You could maybe imagine others, but I think what you've illustrated here very nicely is that balance that I was talking about between somehow having some kind of fee that covers output, but then something extra over that that aligns us and drives us towards the better outcomes, which after all is what we actually want.
Yes.
That's what we actually want. So therefore, shouldn't that be the thing we get rewarded for?
I think it does raise some interesting questions around how you measure that. So you mentioned a minute ago around actually, almost digital transformation enabling us to be able to measure some of these sort of micro impacts of our work on the overall outcome, and you can see that very clearly if you have sort of a digital twin model. Actually, you can it's almost completely evidential around what your impact on the outcome was, because you could imagine, in our current scenario, there might be all sorts of, if we didn't have digital transformation, it would be a challenge actually for us to be able to sort of accurately demonstrate that impact on the outcome there. So I think there's something in that around, almost a virtuous circle, being able to deliver better digital transformation and actually that being able to demonstrate more clearly the impact that we've had on the overall outcome.
Yes, very much so. And I think what that's all about is actually integration. While we all do our own little thing in our own little silos and it's not joined up, then we don't get to what you just talked about. When it is joined up across an enterprise, which is genuinely working together towards delivering those outcomes, then it is joined up. And one of the key things that enables it to be joined up is this digital transformation.
Yes.
Because if there's anything that digital transformation should be about, it's about being integrative, because information joins things up.
Yes.
And silos keeps them separate, but information is a golden thread that joins it all up. So we're kind of familiar with that message, but I don't think that we've actually built that out across the industry yet.
No.
We know that it's the right thing to do, but we haven't seen it really genuinely happening yet. And I obviously think it needs to.
Yeah, no, I think it does. But we're getting back to the earlier slide that I put up that had the triangle, and it had actually the function of the industry is to be able to integrate around that and move between the clients, and that is very much being able to sort of see beyond what your current client is asking you for to actually what are the outcomes that this intervention should be delivering, and who else might benefit, and how could you demonstrate that? I think that's hugely valuable actually if the consultancy firms can start to get to that.
It is hugely valuable, and therefore we should get paid for it.
Which is
because it's of real value.
So Andrew, how do we get paid for it?
Yes, and I think from a legal perspective, this sort of arrangement, the key point will be defining what that output is, that success is determined by, and really if it is just a bipartite contract, that output is linked to the services that the consultant's providing or whatever else they're providing. It's not dependent on provision of works by a contractor, for example, which will be outside the consultant's control. So it's kind of just finding ways of defining these goals and incentives that are clearly linked to what's being provided. And I think that also would touch upon the fitness for purpose point as well. If it's clearly something that's linked to the services, that would limit the risk of fitness for purpose. And the other side of it, I think, is setting them up in a way so that the bonus is a bonus, it's not a penalty. So that if the incentive is achieved, you get a paid additional. Sometimes not a case of if the client doesn't achieve it, the consultant will be liable for X, Y, Z. So it's the business model being set up in a way so that works for the consultant. I guess the other side of thing that I'm seeing, which is linked to this, it's not exactly what's on the presentation, but I think it's an extension of it, would be where the output is a physical output. For example, an app or some software that the client then uses to assess its business or users on an ongoing basis, and that is an extremely different business model where you end up thinking of things like charging a license fee after you've got to the end of the service, and taking into account how that's going to be maintained. But that is a shift beyond what's envisaged here.
Yeah, I think we've got a so I think you're absolutely right, and actually that's possibly something we want to pick up as a separate case today. I think you're right to say it is very, very different. So yeah, an output wouldn't necessarily be something that had an ongoing either benefit to the client or something that they would reuse again and again. I think that you're right there, and it should be quite a defined, almost milestone or product that's delivered. I think there's definitely a lot for us to unpick on that sort of performance bonus, and how I think I've seen all sorts of variations in contracts around how you actually codify that. So there's something for us to look up some examples of, I would suggest, going forward. Right, so I'm conscious of time. We've been very quiet with questions, so we're just going to carry on, actually, because we're enjoying ourselves. If we just...
Are there any questions coming up?
Let's have a... No, so we just had a look. So we're a little quiet. We've got a question. Okay, so that is, how do these models fit with the work of smaller consultancies? So I think we've got something in there to start to look at. Now, some of them you could see, potentially I already am aware of some of the smaller consultancies working on that output basis, particularly if they're working for private sector clients. I think there's definitely something in there, and actually, potentially the smaller consultancies are leading the way in that. But perhaps for the other two, as a sort of closing point, really, whether we can have a think about how are these applicable, or are smaller consultancies going to be on that sort of expertise hours-based model forever? I shall save my comment to the end, but I shall ask you, Mark, what do you think?
I think that is a natural place for them to sit. I mean, that's kind of what they are. They're experts at some expertise. But I would also say that that concept of being rewarded for microtransactions would also be relevant to small consultancies too.
And actually, following on from that, if you are an expert in a defined area, sometimes that can have a huge benefit to the overall outcome. If it's your expertise that is, say, mitigating a really large environmental risk, or enabling something really specific to happen in a complicated design. So I think there is definitely scope. It's perhaps just shift from where we were before. So in terms of that kind of output and outcome, I don't think outcome is necessarily of scale. It's probably on impact. So perhaps if we look at it through that lens, it is more applicable. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, my side of things would be, if I look at BIM as something I've looked at quite a lot, that's an area where small consultancy have really been in their element, I guess, because small consultancies are, by definition, they're more nimble, they're more able to change business practices to take advantage of these sort of changes and be more innovative. So to some extent, new ways of working create a lot of opportunities for small consultancies, because they don't have thousands of people they need to get working in a different way and charging in a different way. It's and there maybe they can take some of these slightly different approaches more easily.
Yeah, I think certainly I'd add to that. I'm already seeing some of ACE's smaller members are doing really interesting things, like creating product companies alongside their consultancy company. So again, just we're not going to touch on it now, but the case study we've got up on the screen around being able to provide a service level, something that the client can reuse again and again. Well, actually, if you've got a little agile product company, it may be that you've created a software package that then it makes it easy for the client to sort of scale it up and commercialize it on your behalf. So I think there's definitely plenty in this for smaller consultancies. I think it sort of requires all of us to take a good look at what value we can offer and where we can offer it. Again, historically, you might have been smaller consultancy on a sort of, within a project or sort of part of a project, whereas actually, if you take a step back, your expertise and your ability to add value is right the way around a sort of client's whole asset base. So it's maybe thinking about how you can deploy that and then get into these sorts of business models. So thank you very much for the question. That was a really good one, and I think certainly something we need to be bearing in mind. Probably got two different migration paths potentially to these types of business models, but equally applicable to both. So It's now 1 o'clock, and if you haven't been eating your lunch already on the line, I'm sure it's time to go and eat it now. So thank you very much all for joining us. We had a good go through some of these case studies. We've got a few more to unpick in future, and also to touch on the really important role of clients in enabling all of this, actually, because we can, you know, try and sell as much as we like, but actually if they're not buying this, we're not going to get very far. So I think that's certainly makes us up perhaps for a second webinar. So thank you very much for joining us. Keep an eye out on the website for future events on this. I think there's almost certainly a need for a second webinar, but also we know we're having a workshop on the 7th of May looking specifically at this, where we will spend a half a day unpacking this in a lot more detail. So I'd encourage as many of you as possible to come and join us in that space. But no, other than to say thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to my panelists for your expert insights. And I look forward to coming back and discussing it more at length in future. Have a good day. Thank you.